Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a webinar focused on Class 6 program permitting and primacy that is being hosted by the states that are signatories to the CO2 Transport Infrastructure MOU and the Regional Deployment Initiative and the State Carbon Capture Work Group. I'm Patrice Lallam. I'm a program consultant to the Great Plains Institute, and I help lead our work on state and regional policy with respect to carbon management. Next slide, please, Lauren. So the CO2 Transport Infrastructure MOU that I just referenced went into effect on October 1 of 2020. Currently, we have 8 states that are signatories to the MOU: Kansas, Louisiana, Maryland, Montana, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, and Wyoming. These states are working collectively together on the formation of an action plan related to CO2 transport infrastructure and storage. Next slide. In addition to the action plan, the states that are signatories have identified staff people that serve on a coordinating group that meets on a regular basis to also talk about how to engage stakeholders around issues of mutual importance, support congressional efforts related to CO2 transport, infrastructure, and storage. And then again, the big piece this year is the development of the action plan slated for release on October 1 of 2021. Next slide. So on the left-hand side here of this slide, it shows the upcoming meeting dates that the coordination group will be holding during the summer months, and we hope to have an action plan draft that is available for some stakeholder input later this fall. We are, conducting additional state outreach to states that may be interested in joining the effort. And over time, over Q4 of 2020 and then this spring, we have held a series of learning webinars. And if there are additional topics that the group identifies that would be useful to host a webinar on, we will certainly proceed with that. Next slide, please. So setting the stage a little bit for today's webinar, and I'm excited to announce our lineup of speakers here in just a moment. But Class 6 and issues around Class 6 have become increasingly of interest to a lot of our stakeholders and states. According to the Carbon Capture Coalition, of the nearly 40 projects that have been announced post-reform of 45Q in 2018, about half have declared their intent to store CO2 in saline formations, which means they would require Class 6 well permits. In FY21, or for FY21, the Energy Act that passed at the end of 2020 did include a $3 million increase in funding for EPA to administer the Class 6 program. And I think Molly and Bill will talk more about that in the federal update piece. And then additionally, the Carbon Capture Coalition and also the MOU states are working actively to engage with Congress to try to pass the SCALE Act, which relates to CO2 transport infrastructure. And that would also increase funding for permitting Class 6 wells and provide grants to states to help them establish their own Class 6 permitting programs. So I just wanted to share some of that context as a backdrop for this webinar. And the map on the right shows the states that we're aware of that are actively engaged. Wyoming and North Dakota have already achieved Class 6 primacy. Other states are exploring interest in seeking primacy for Class 6, and then states like Louisiana have applications on EPA's desk to hopefully receive primacy in the future. So that is a little bit of a backdrop just around Class 6 before we dive in. And Lauren, if you want to go to the next slide, I will go ahead and take a moment to introduce all at once our fantastic slate of speakers today. And we are going to start off with a federal update on Class 6. So we have Molly McEvoy, who is a general engineer in the UIC program for EPA. out of the headquarters office in Washington, D.C. Molly joined the agency in July of 2019, and she currently serves as the staff lead for Class 6 program activities at EPA headquarters. Molly is joined by Bill Bates, who is a national program manager within EPA's Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water, where he oversees activities associated with the underground injection control program, and he's been with EPA for 16 years. After we hear from Molly and from Bill, we're going to turn to some officials from some states to get some perspective on Class 6 and where things stand. Lily Barkau is the Groundwater Section Manager for the Water Quality Division at the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality. She's been with that agency for 15 years, and she oversees the UIC program for Class 1, 5, and 6 wells currently for that agency. Kevin Connors with UND's EERC. He's a principal policy and regulatory strategist with EERC, and he works with a multidisciplinary team of scientists, engineers, and business professionals to integrate legal and regulatory policy, economics, and tax perspectives with applied research related to incremental oil recovery, unconventional oil recovery, and CO2 capture and geologic storage. Leslie Savage is joining us today from the great state of Texas. She's the Chief Geologist for the Oil and Gas Division of the Railroad Commission there in Texas. She's currently responsible for coordinating rulemaking for the division, coordinating with federal and other state agencies, and water quality certification of federal permits. And batting cleanup, and certainly last but not least, is Blake Canfield, who is the Executive Counsel for the Louisiana Department of Natural Resources. He manages that agency's legal division, and he's responsible for some legislative matters and advising the Secretary and agency staff, as well as matters concerning the agency's regulation of Louisiana's abundant natural resources. So we really do have an exciting slate of speakers today, and we hope to also have the opportunity for robust Q&A towards the end of the webinar. If you do have questions along the way, please do use the chat feature, and we will certainly try to get questions answered. We are recording this webinar, and we will circulate the recording and accompanying slide decks at the conclusion or shortly after the webinar concludes. So with that, it's my great pleasure to turn the stage over to Molly and Bill for a federal update on Class 6. Thank you.
All right, apologize, just trying to get things moved around. So I hope everyone can see my slides. If you can't, please indicate so I can figure out how to change that. So good afternoon. I'm Bill Bates. So I thought we would kind of start this off just a little bit on the background of Safe Drinking Water Act, Class 6, and primary enforcement responsibility, and then we can kind of move into some of the updates that we've been kind of working on over the past 2 years. A lot of the work that we've been recently working on, I think it is in part kind of recognizing that there's been an accelerated interest in Class 6 over the last couple of years, and also, kind of recognizing that, there was a lull for quite some time after the regulations were passed, and really wanted to kind of make sure that we're positioning, the agency in a position to be able to kind of meet the expected demand that we believe will be coming in, well, this year and in future years. So just a brief overview on the Safe Drinking Water Act, at least how it kind of ties to the Underground Injection Control Program. So the Safe Drinking Water Act mandates EPA to regulate underground injection of most fluids and prohibits the injection that endangers underground sources of drinking water. It also authorizes EPA to develop minimum federal regulations for the UIC program to protect underground sources of drinking water. And lastly, the Safe Drinking Water Act also established a process for EPA to approve primacy for states, territories, and tribes. So in 2010, EPA finalized the Class 6 regulations, and thereby making Class 6 the most recent addition to our well classification scheme. Class 6 is one of the more complex well classes. This is because of the unique considerations that need to be taken into account for these sorts of projects. Some of these considerations include the large injection volumes that are expected, the anticipated long duration of these projects, as well as just the fluid itself that's being injected. Recognizing that CO2 is very mobile and buoyant and could be corrosive. So because of these unique considerations, we have targeted, or I should say tailored requirements for Class 6, particularly around computational modeling of the area of review, testing and monitoring throughout the injection, or I should say throughout the lifetime of the project, during injection and post-injection, as well as having financial responsibility requirements. So, we kind of, I'd say, break up the permitting, and I'd say in almost a 4-phased approach. During the pre-construction phase, so this is really looking at the application that's being submitted. The goal of the program is to evaluate the suitability of the site based upon the available information, and to identify ways to address or mitigate any of the uncertainties. During the pre-injection phase, so this would be when the permit for construction has been issued. The goal during this phase would be to address any of the uncertainties identified during the permit application review. In addition, we want to confirm that the well was constructed to maintain mechanical integrity throughout the duration of the project, and is equipped to monitor injection operations and shut-in if needed. One thing that I forgot to mention at the start of the slide is that you'll see a bunch of sub-bullets on here, and these are just kind of representing the various elements that need to be taken into consideration for each one of these phases. So during the injection phase, so this would be after the facility has received authorization to inject. The goal here is to ensure that the well and the project are operating as planned and in compliance with the permit, and to ensure that the well is not endangering USDWs. The last phase of this permitting effort is post-injection. So here, we want to make sure that the project continues to be protective of USDWs, and also to confirm that post-injection milestones are met prior to abandonment of the site. So from here, I thought it would be good to kind of move to primary enforcement responsibility, or primacy, just to really give a broad brush overview of what is entailed about primacy. So first off, Safe Drinking Water Act encourages states, territories, and tribes to seek primary enforcement responsibility for the UIC program. And there's really two paths in which a state, tribe, or territory can get access, or I should say be given authority for the UIC program. And it's based on two sections within the Safe Drinking Water Act. The first section is 1422, and this requires that states, territories, and tribes develop a regulatory structure that meets the minimum federal requirements. The second section is 1425, and in this section, it requires states, territories, and tribes to demonstrate that their program is effective at protecting underground sources of drinking water. It's also important to note that 1425 is really only available for Class 2 programs. Throughout the history of the UIC program, I think it's important to note that most states that have primacy were granted primacy during the 80s. There was a large initial push, between 1982 and I believe 88, where a lot of states were granted primary enforcement responsibility. There were also a lot of programs that came in between 1990 and 2000. So, this picture here really kind of portrays the state of play as far as who has primacy and for what. You'll notice here that the two states that are shaded purple are North Dakota and Wyoming. These two states have primacy for the entire UIC program 1 through 6, and it's in these two states it is differentiated between 1422 and 1425. In some states, the state has chosen to take on, say, 1 through 5 through their 1422 program. And some of that is kind of recognized in the green. We didn't really differentiate, where a state has primacy for all the program underneath one act versus, let's say 4 of the well classes in one section and, class 2 in the other. And then in red, we have states and tribes that have primacy only for class 2. And I will note that on this slide, we have Michigan in red, which is not quite finalized yet. So currently, EPA still has primary enforcement responsibility for class 2 in Michigan. That was an oversight on my part, I apologize. So that is currently in works on granting Michigan primary enforcement responsibility for class 2. So I think, in one of the slides that was mentioned at the onset, it kind of highlighted states that, EPA is working with related to class 6 and states that are expressing some level of interest. And so, we try to keep our website up to date as far as, the states that we're actively working with in regards to the primacy effort. And so on that website right now, we've identified West Virginia, Arizona, and Louisiana as states that, we're, very actively working with in the pre-application phase or close to the next aspect of the phase of really kind of determining completeness. But we are aware of other states that are, have been engaging with us, such as some of the ones that were shown in that slide, like Texas and Oklahoma. So this last aspect related to primacy is really kind of outlining, what I'd say the workflow associated with primary enforcement responsibility, looks like. So there's the pre-application kind of phase where, there's meetings and discussions between the states and EPA, identifying what needs to be a part of the package that's presented to EPA. That typically includes a memorandum of understanding, a program description, a letter from the governor, a letter from the attorney general, the rules that the state is putting forward, a crosswalk of the rules with the federal regulations, and any sort of documentation on the public participation. So we really want to make sure that all of those pieces are in good shape before the official submittal to the agency. This allows us to be able to kind of, say, more quickly process the other elements of the flow here. Once it's submitted to EPA, it's typically submitted to our regional office. The regional office will do a review and the regional administrator will recommend the package for approval by the administrator. That package is then set to my shop for review, and we start putting together the proposed rule. One of the things that we've been trying to do more recently is combine the completeness determination with the proposed rule. So we have one notice that is sent out for both of those aspects. So the rule language typically speaks specifically to the proposed rule, and then it also mentions that this is also the completeness determination. This really helps us kind of streamline the process as much as we can, recognizing that UIC primacy is not a program that can be delegated to the regional administrator for final approval. It has to be approved by the administrator of EPA. Once the proposed rule is done, we collect the comments, review, develop a response to comments if needed, and then make the final determination for rulemaking. And so from here, I'm going to hand it off to Molly, but I did want to make one point related to the mention of the omnibus from 21 that was finalized in December, December of 2000. So in there was language that was directed specifically to EPA. One was related to providing an additional $3 million to the agency to support development within the program, or I should say within the EPA to support Class 6 activities. And it also touched on the need to develop a report that looks at our permitting process. And so that report is due to Congress at the end of December. And so we're actively working on that right now. The $3 million that were mentioned, we're really looking at trying to utilize those funds to really support the regional offices and getting up to speed, making sure that they have the necessary knowledge base to be able to make permitting decisions. And some of that is by using contract vehicles to make sure that we're able to have a timely review of the permit applications. And so from here, I'm going to hand it off to Molly to speak to the rest.
Thank you. So as has been mentioned, over the past couple of years, EPA has seen a major uptick in interest in Class 6. And this is due in part to financial incentives for carbon capture utilization and storage, such as the 45Q tax credit, as well as a recognition that geologic sequestration is an important tool for climate change mitigation. And to respond to the increased interest in Class 6 permitting and Class 6 primacy from state agencies, EPA has been working to streamline the permitting process for both the applicant and the permit reviewer. We have developed and are continuing to develop new tools for permitting authorities, both EPA and state agencies, Class 6 well permit applicants, and the general public. We are also supporting interagency CCUS initiatives requested by Congress in the 2021 Omnibus Bill, which was just mentioned, and other initiatives designed to commercialize CCUS. And through all of this, EPA is committed to supporting Class 6 permit applicants and primacy states. Thank you. This map depicts the level of engagement EPA has had with prospective Class 6 permit applicants by state where the potential project would be located. States highlighted in light green indicate that EPA has met with 1 to 2 entities interested in applying for a Class 6 permit in that state. The medium green indicates we have met with 3 to 5 companies looking for a site in that state. And finally, the dark green shows states where 6 or more parties have met with EPA to discuss their interest in applying for a Class 6 permit. And from this figure, you can see we have seen the most interest for potential projects in Illinois, California, and Louisiana. And I'll note that EPA implements the Class 6 program in all states in the US except North Dakota and Wyoming, and so that information is not on here. Also not shown here are the many other engagements that EPA has recently had with parties that have not narrowed in on a particular site or state but are interested in Class 6. In all, EPA has met with over 50 companies to discuss the Class 6 permitting process, answer technical questions, and learn about potential injection projects. There are currently 2 active Class 6 permits in the country. Both are for a project in EPA Region 5 located in Illinois. And EPA is currently processing 3 complete permit applications. One is for a project in Region 9 located in California. And 2 are for a project in Indiana. And while the number of active and pending permits is fairly low based on our level of engagement, we expect that numbers will go up in the near future. EPA has developed 3 tools that are or will soon be on our website. The first is a Class 6 permit application outline, and a screenshot of that is shown here on the slide. And this tool is currently available on our website. This document is designed to guide the permit applicant through the different aspects of a Class 6 application. Following the promulgation of the final Class 6 rule in 2010, EPA developed a series of comprehensive UIC Class 6 well guidance documents, which are also available on our website. The final guidance documents contain over 1,000 pages of content So in response to that, to support applicants, this outline document crosswalks to the different sections of several key guidance documents to provide an understanding of the information that EPA would need in order to evaluate a Class 6 permit application. The second tool is a table of permitted and proposed Class 6 wells. The table will contain information on Class 6 wells permitted by EPA and Class 6 permit applications that have been submitted to EPA for review. The table includes information on the table will include information on well location, project phase, and permit status. General operating information such as CO2 injection volumes is also provided for permits that have been finalized and issued. And the purpose of this table will be to highlight where Class 6 CO2 injection is taking place and where it may occur in the near future. Once finalized, this table will be available on our website, and we'll keep it up to date with current information. And we'll also include with that table copies of final Class 6 permits, the actual permits. And lastly, we have developed a series of trainings on the Geologic sequestration data tool that we are working to release onto our website. The GSDT is a centralized web-based system that EPA uses to receive, store, and manage Class 6 data. And I'll discuss that system a little bit on the next slide. We have developed a total of 5 video tutorials that provide viewers with an overview of the system's structure and capabilities and provides instructions for using the system. Now, while the GSDT tutorials are new tools that will soon be released, the GSDT itself is an existing tool that the EPA developed several years ago with the Department of Energy's Pacific Northwest National Laboratory to support Class 6 permitting. In states where EPA is the permitting authority, Class 6 permit applicants must submit all required application materials and reports to EPA via this system. The GSDT is structured to act as a guide to the Class 6 permit application submission process. The system also contains application templates that can be downloaded to support developing a Class 6 permit application. The basis for these templates can be found in those EPA guidance documents for Class 6, which are available on our website, but applicants may find this format more user-friendly. And for additional assistance navigating the GSDT, we also have user guides available for download within the system. Class 6 well owners or operators in states where EPA is the permitting authority need to request access to this tool to receive a username and password. And we have a fact sheet about this system on our website that provides additional information about how to access the system and just general information about it. And if you have any questions about the system, including how to access it, you can always email the GSDT email address, which I've included on this slide, and is gsdatatool@epa.gov. EPA has also been developing a number of additional tools designed to support states and help build EPA capacity for Class 6 permitting and streamline the permitting review process. First, last year, our team presented an 8-part training series that covered Class 6 program implementation. The training was originally given to EPA staff, and it's since been recorded and converted to a video format. These videos were recently posted to a system called Fed Talent, where state staff and EPA will be able to access the materials. And those are the images I have here on the right. We also developed a structure for multi-regional Class 6 permit review teams to evaluate Class 6 permit applications submitted to EPA. These teams will help facilitate learning and knowledge sharing among the regions and headquarters and potentially streamline resources for efficient permit reviews and decisions. The review teams would also foster a consistent approach among EPA regions in reviewing the applications, so permittees could expect a more uniform experience in the process, regardless of what location their injection project was located in. And we also have procedures for engaging states into this process. Lastly, I wanted to highlight an added benefit of the GSDT for permitting authorities, and that is the system's data management capabilities, which can be particularly important given the expected long lifetime of Class 6 projects. All EPA regions need to use the system, as I stated. States with Class 6 primacy are not required to use the GSDT, but they can elect to do so and adopt it for their own Class 6 data management needs. And states applying for Class 6 primacy, can request access to the system as well. And to wrap up our presentation, we wanted to provide an update on additional tools under development at EPA. I have a few examples listed here. First is a sample or example Class 6 permit application. It would contain mock-up site data and will have a goal of conveying the level of detail and types of data and the narratives that permit reviewers will need to reach a permitting decision for Class 6 wells. Second, we recognize that perhaps the most complex component of the Class 6 application is the computational modeling that is required to delineate the well's area of review. And we are working on putting together additional trainings to build modeling review capacity for permitting authorities. And finally, we're working on a large upgrade to the GSDT, Geologic Sequestration Data Tool. Currently, the system is not designed to transmit or store confidential business information or proprietary data, but this coming upgrade will include updating the system so that CBI can be stored and exchanged between the permit applicant and the permitting authorities directly within the system. With that, we reach the end of our slides. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Molly and Bill. I have two questions. One came through in the chat. Molly, this one is for you that I think we should just take now rather than holding till the end. And the question is from Sarah Wade, and will the permit table list all Class 6 permits or just the one that EPA approved and not the states with primacy?
For now, we're definitely focusing on the states where EPA would be the permitting authority. That's the focus. Bill, is there anything else?
Okay, thank you.
You don't have anything
thank you. Okay, thank you. And then Bill, for you, you referenced the report to Congress that's due December 27th, and I think somewhere along the way, I heard August or kind of that summer time frame where you're really trying to get this thing all together. What would be the stakeholder opportunity to engage with you or react or be a part of the report as it's developed?
Right. So currently we're working on the stakeholder engagement component of that, kind of recognizing that, we have a really quick turnaround with this report. And so we're trying to make sure that, we get enough information into the report that's responsive to Congress's request. So we are looking at, different ways to be able to kind of reach out to various stakeholders that the omnibus has directed us to, be a part of this report evaluation. I believe you're on mute now, Patrice.
You would think a year into using Zoom, I would be much more well-versed than I am. So apologies. So thank you, Molly and Bill, for the information and for joining us in your presentations today. We'll have the opportunity for more interactive Q&A toward the end of the webinar. Now it is my great pleasure to turn to some of the states. We'll kick it off with representatives from the states with primacy, and Lily Barkau with the state of Wyoming. I think we will kick it off with you and your presentation. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, Patrice. Let me share that. And can you see my presentation?
Yes, you can.
Okay. So thanks for having me here today. I'm with the state of Wyoming. We gained primacy in August of last year. My presentation is going to look at Wyoming's process for primacy and then our next steps now that we have primacy. So our process started back in 2008. The Wyoming legislature amended the statutes to include the authority to regulate geologic sequestration wells. In 2009, further amendments to the statute was to clarify the roles of the Wyoming Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, as well as the Department of Environmental Quality. So that in 2010, statutes again were modified to add financial assurance requirements and a special revenue account, and I'll talk about those here in a little bit. So Chapter 24, which is our Class 6 rule, was promulgated, and at that point it did not include financial assurance requirements. So from 2013 to 2016, we had an informal rulemaking that included the 2015 EPA crosswalk recommendations, financial assurance requirements, and the injection depth waiver requirements into those rulemaking steps. In 2016, we had a further process added to these statutes on how we would convert the Class 2 wells to the Class 6, just to give further clarification for that. And also in 2016, we started our discussions with EPA on primacy. 2017, we started drafting that primacy application and ultimately submitted that in January of 2018. So we received comments from EPA on Chapter 24. At that time, a lot of our rule encompassed the original draft CFR. So we had to re-enter rulemaking as part of our primacy application process, which included 2019 going to the Water Waste Advisory Board and then the Environmental Quality Council. We submitted, or Region 8 recommended the primacy application to headquarters, and then we started down the formal application process with primacy in August. Currently, we're working collaboratively with EPA for some revisions to the rule. They identified some areas that could enhance the rule for clarification or items that may have been missing. So we're in a kind of an informal rulemaking process right now to get those revisions in and finalizing that. Hopefully that'll be finalized by the end of 2021 here. So with that, the next steps for program administration now that we have primacy, what is that going to look like? How long, what are the steps that are going to take to get that permit application all the way to permit issuance, and then finally helping operators to get to the final operations. And then what's going to look like, what are our programs going to look like once that permit is issued? How are we going to be conducting compliance reviews, inspections, and those items? So permit application. We're going to have to review the application. How are we going to determine that that application is complete? What in-house expertise do we have? This is a pretty complex project. So do we have everything that we're going to need, as well as meeting all of the statutory requirements as part of the review? And then a permit application fee. Under our statutes, we get to charge an application fee. Any unused fees are returned. So how much are we going to charge? What all is going to go into that fee? And that would mean that we need to look at the components of the application review, which would lead to setting up a permit checklist. So here at DEQ, we have put together a permit application checklist, which includes the Class 6 permit application that was part of our primacy application package, taking Chapter 24, and then components of statute that may not have been covered under the rule specifically. Such things was originally liability insurance. That's now getting included into the rule during this additional revision. So just making sure everything's there for this checklist. We also found that it was very helpful, the EPA guidance documents for UIC program directors outlining the different components of the Class 6 or the sequestration project itself. So permit application review team, we're going to need people to review for site characterization, geologists, hydrogeologists, geochemists, geophysics, quite a bit of information just alone from the site characterization. Then modeling, I was really glad to hear Molly mention that there's assistance coming with the modeling specifically for delineating the area of review. often states don't have that kind of expertise in-house, and that was of specific concern to me of how to address that. Well construction and testing, having well engineers and expert geologists to help with those items. Finance, we have financial assurance, liability insurance, and then our special revenue account. So the world of accountants and economists is vastly different than those of us as scientists. So getting those right people involved. And then risk analysis to evaluate emergency and remedial response, making sure that's all set up. And then, of course, having our policy and legal and regulatory expertise, those of us here at the state, along with our Attorney General's office, and then assistance from EPA will also be helpful. So the process, are we going to need any permits prior to the well construction, as they collect the data? What information are we going to need to determine that application was complete and to address those 6 areas that I identified on the other slides? So if a potential applicant was to collect data prior to the Class 6 application, are we going to need any permits? Evaluations, including stratigraphic tests, similar to the Oil and Gas Commission. And then how would this activity roll into the Class 6 application? Or are we going to require a full Class 6 permit prior to collecting any data? So just items that we're going to need to look at. So as part of the overall system, like I mentioned, we developed a checklist. It's actually a rather large checklist. It's 73 pages long at this point, and it includes every possible scenario that we could look at for conversions of other UIC wells to a Class 6, and then specifically what statute calls out for our Class 2 to Class 6 conversions. How is everything going to be evaluated, and is that something staff can do, or do we need to get a contractor involved? So just helping us to get these items set up prior to that first application coming in. And then how much time and effort is going to go into that permit application, having our technical reviews, financial assurance reviews, modeling, which as I mentioned before, is probably an area that we just don't have the in-house expertise, and getting a consultant in to look at that. Under statutes, we have 60 days to do a completeness review. So we're going to have to do quite a bit of evaluation in a short amount of time. So hoping for some pre-application meetings to iron out any issues that we may have. And then, as you can see, just continued drafting the permit, public participation for our outreach, the public notice period of 60 days. And then if a hearing's requested as part of that, 30 days. So trying to do some outreach earlier to assist with that public participation as well. So, if you use these numbers, it could be 100 days, it could be 3 months, it could be a year. We're hoping to be able to get these addressed as quickly as possible to help the regulated community to get up and running. Other areas that we're looking at, data management. We need to get a better understanding of the GSDT that EPA has, how we're going to track permitting, monitoring, and other compliance requirements, the forms that we're going to need, the reporting frequencies. These are all outlined as permit conditions once we issue that permit, so that will certainly help us to develop that tracking. Field processes, how are we going to inspect, evaluate testing? Again, all part of permit conditions. And then the different financial assurance, an area that we're still working on and evaluating is the liability insurance aspect. Financial assurance for plugging abandonment, I think, is pretty much in place. What kind of insurance is going to be required of these facilities to get up and running? And then our special revenue account, which is another rule that we'll be drafting here in the future for once a site goes through closure and financial assurance is returned to the operator, what funds are going to be available to the state to continue evaluating protection of USDWs from that former well. So in conclusion, what does the program look like after primacy with Wyoming and North Dakota currently having primacy? We're going on to our next steps. What is it going to look like? What do we need to review in application? So staff and consultants, computer, hardware, and software. That modeling, states just don't have the funding to get that kind of hardware or software in place. So making sure we've got the funds available for consultants. And then what's required of our rules, and then using the checklist as a guide. So that concludes my presentation. And again, thanks for having me today.
Lily, thank you so much for that overview of the state of play in Wyoming and what you're thinking about. Just one question specifically for you before we turn to Kevin. What is DEQ's estimate to approve a Class 6 permit from the time it's initiated to approval?
Really depends on the condition of the application when it comes in. If we have some pre-application meetings and site characterization and everything seems to be pretty good in line, we're hoping for under a year to get that application out from start of receiving the application all the way through the public notice and issuance process.
Thanks for that, Lily. And now we are going to turn to Kevin Connors, the great state of North Dakota, who is at the EERC. Kevin, take it away.
Thank you very much. Okay, so my name is Kevin Connors. I'm the Principal Policy and Regulatory Strategist for the Energy and Environmental Research Center at the University of North Dakota. I also manage the Plains CO2 Reduction Partnership Program. And the PCOR program is a regional carbon sequestration program sponsored by the U.S. Department of Energy, National Energy Technology Laboratories. And it's one of 4 regional carbon sequestration partnership programs. And the PCOR program has played a role into where North Dakota is at today. And I get the great honor in somewhat representing North Dakota. And the reason behind that is I'm going to be talking about North Dakota's Class 6 primacy application and primacy approval, and then the permitting process in North Dakota. And so prior to working for the EERC, I got the opportunity to work for the state of North Dakota. And pretty early on in my career, I got the opportunity to represent the state in the efforts for North Dakota to get Class 6 primacy and working directly with EPA through that entire process. And I also, for a few years with the state, not only did I help develop the CCS regulatory program and get Class 6 primacy, but I also administered the Class 2 program. So I'm very familiar with both Class 6 and Class 2 in terms of underground injection control well classes. The opinions expressed in this presentation are mine, and they're not the U.S. Department of Energy or the National Energy Technology Laboratory. So I want to start with PCOR. And PCOR is important because of the history, and that will, and I'll quickly get to North Dakota, but the Plains CO2 Reduction Partnership has always been led by the EERC. The Plains, the PCOR region is identified in the map there in the green. Today, we're partnered with the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources and the University of Alaska Fairbanks Institute of Northern Engineering. I saw some of our partners at the University of Wyoming on the call, so certainly we are enjoying that partnership with PCOR efforts, and that's been really great to have them with us. But I want to talk about early on in PCOR. In 2003, 2005, when the Regional Carbon Sequestration Partnership programs began, the initial work was to look at the region, identify the major stationary industrial sources of CO2, and then the geologic formations that would be ideal for long-term storage of CO2. But in addition to that characterization, that source sink matching, it was quickly identified as there wasn't any policy or regulations in place to regulate these activities. After the characterization phase, that led to small-scale field validation, which led to large-scale commercial demonstration, namely Bell Creek CO2 EOR field in southeastern Montana. And then that gets us to today, where we're looking at commercial deployment and really accelerated commercial deployment. So now I'm going to just transition over to North Dakota and the work that was done there. And there's just some foundational pieces that were put in place early on that I think are key for considering Class 6 primacy or considering state regulating these activities. And the first question that needs to be answered is which agency will regulate these activities? And in North Dakota, in the 2009 legislation, the North Dakota legislature granted that authority to the North Dakota Industrial Commission, Oil and Gas Division. The next question is, how will these activities be regulated? North Dakota adopted a project-centric approach or a resource management philosophy framework in terms of regulating CO2 storage. And so that question directly relates to the following question, which is, who owns the pore space? And so in 2009, the legislature enacted a new section of the Century Code, and that gave ownership of the pore space to the surface owner. So that's key to the pore space being regulated as a resource. North Dakota declares in their statute that CO2 is a commodity. It's in the public interest to promote geologic storage of CO2. And the last question is long-term liability and who is responsible for a closed CO2 storage site. The legislature in 2009 created a trust fund account. There's a per ton of carbon dioxide fee that gets paid into that account during the operational phase of a project. And then there's a process to release an operator of liability 10 years post-injection after the CO2 plume is stabilized. There's a process to work through to be released of liability, transfer that liability to the state of North Dakota, and that trust fund kicks in for the long-term monitoring and management of a closed site. So those are some key foundational pieces that were established early on in North Dakota. Here's a timeline. I already mentioned, the early efforts with PCOR, that led to the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission, Carbon Storage Task Force developed a model rule and a model statute in 2007. In 2008, at the request of the North Dakota governor, Governor Hoeven at the time, now Senator Hoeven, there was a work group formed in North Dakota that made up of different government agencies like the Oil and Gas Division, the Attorney General's Office, the Department of Environmental Quality, and then some of the different industries like the lignite industry, oil and gas industry, and EERC was involved in that work group, and then some other some energy attorneys that have been very familiar with the state. And that work group drafted the legislation that was proposed in 2009 or introduced in 2009 and enacted, and that's the legislation that created that foundation for North Dakota. 2009 legislative session and the enactment of that legislation was followed by a rulemaking by the Oil and Gas Division. So in April of 2010, North Dakota had a complete and comprehensive regulatory framework established and in place. And following that April, in the December of 2010 is when EPA published the Class 6 rule and created a new well class, Class 6. That was followed by 2011, North Dakota legislature created a one full-time position for that person to go out and obtain Class 6 primacy. And that was the opportunity that I received at the time. I was working for the state in their field office in Williston and got the opportunity to transfer down to Bismarck and begin those efforts. And so this is, Bill put a slide up with a diagram of different phases of the primacy process. And so we began the pre-application activities with EPA, working directly with headquarters and the Region 8 office. And what we did is we worked through the crosswalk process, and it was over 200 pages of tables where we showed the North Dakota rules met the stringency of the federal rules. That process took about a year, and then North Dakota went into a rulemaking because you can't apply for Class 6 primacy unless your regulations are codified. So that took about a year. So we had about 2 years of that pre-application activity process with EPA. Once North Dakota had regulations that were as stringent as the Class 6 rules that were effective and codified into the North Dakota Administrative Code, then we could turn around and apply for primacy, which we did in June of 2013. And that began the EPA process of them determining, reviewing the application and determining whether it was complete. That process took many years, as many of you know. And North Dakota received primacy approval about 5 years later in April of 2018 in that final federal rulemaking. I just want to jump into the permitting process in North Dakota. We've worked really closely at the EERC with the state of North Dakota. One of my current role with the EERC is I'm supporting a lot of these first projects in North Dakota that are carbon storage projects that are working toward getting permitted with the state. So I'm very familiar with the process. I've had a great opportunity the last couple of years to be doing this work. So we've worked really closely with the state, and we've identified a 7-month permitting process in North Dakota, and that begins at the permit applications officially submitted. There's about a 2-month review process that includes the Oil and Gas Division and through statute the Department of Environmental Quality. There's a consultation period with the DEQ. So both agencies get an opportunity to review the permit and the draft permit and then provide comments to the applicant. Once that process is complete, then we begin the notification process. The applicant has to give a 45-day notification to all the pore space owners and all the mineral owners. And then the state gives a 30-day notification of the hearing, of the public hearing that's been established, and opens up the public comment period for 30 days. Then a public hearing takes place, and then the application goes to the Industrial Commission of North Dakota, which is the governor, the attorney general, and the ag commissioner, and they have the final approval. And so we've identified a 7 to 12 month would be the high end. Through administrative code, the commission needs to make a decision within 12 months of determining an application is complete. I just want to quickly point out to everyone here. I mean, one of the things that I wanted to just highlight is there's potential and negative impacts to the momentum we're seeing today. And right now in Washington, D.C., there's the Clean Futures Act is proposed, and it's proposing a new well class, Class 7. I have concerns with that. I think the state of North Dakota has concerns with that. We see that as potentially creating regulatory uncertainty for EOR project operators and developers. Now, the Class 7 would look at enhanced oil recovery injection for CO2, and it proposes to add potential protection to underground sources of drinking water. This is already regulated and has been for many years under the Class 2 UIC program. So it's redundant, and I don't see a benefit in environmental benefit in protecting USCWs. The Class 2 UIC program is already as effective as the federal program in protecting USDWs. It could really deter our current long opportunities for long-term permanent CO2 storage and emissions reduction that we're looking at today. And it imposes incremental work onto the state UIC programs and staff. And there's already in the Class 6 rules, there's already a way to transition injection well Class 2 to Class 6 for long-term geologic storage. CO2 EOR is regulated in a project-centric approach, so it's not just the Class 2 injection wells. Obviously, there's mineral lease agreements, there's oil and gas unit operations, there's mineral extraction, and then there's the injection wells. Those units are established by the Oil and Gas Regulatory Agency, and those Class 2 injection wells are permitted in a way that they do protect USDWs. Keep in mind there's some concern there with, it could be conflicting because each oil and gas state agencies are typically mandated by law to maximize ultimate oil and gas recovery. So adding a new injection well class could be unnecessary and duplicate a lot of effort that's been being done for years, and those regulatory programs are mature and established. So North Dakota specifically opposes the creation of a new Class 7 well class, and I wanted to take this opportunity just to highlight that. Again, these are my opinions and not the opinions of DOE. So, thank you.
Thanks so much, Kevin, for that overview and the context you provided. Much appreciated. With that, I think we're going to turn to Leslie Savage in Texas to provide an update on where things stand in your great state. Leslie.
Great, thank you, Patrice. I'm Leslie Savage, been with the Commission for over 38 years. The Class 6 UIC program has been interesting and challenging, and we have a lot more challenges to come. Today, if you would slide. Today, I'm just going to talk about the legislation, the rules that we've adopted, and then our efforts towards primacy. Next slide, please. Texas legislature established the framework for CO2 geologic storage in 2009 under Senate Bill 1387. The biggest thing, or the biggest impact to at least the Railroad Commission, is that the statute split jurisdiction between two agencies. The Railroad Commission has jurisdiction over geologic CO2 in and the injection of CO2 into a reservoir that's initially or maybe productive of oil, gas, geothermal resources, or a saline formation directly above or below that reservoir. And then the TCQ has jurisdiction over all other saline geologic storage. If you look at that language, it can be very confusing. There can be differences of opinion on what formations, what reservoirs, where it begins and ends. And so there's a lot of potential confusion there. I will mention that we are currently in our legislative session, which ends on Monday. And House Bill 1284 was filed, and I'm proud to say is on the way to the governor's office, hopefully for his signature. And House Bill 1284 would consolidate jurisdiction at the Railroad Commission. In 2009, Senate Bill 1387 required that several different agencies, the Railroad Commission, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, the Bureau of Economic Geology at the University of Texas, Austin, as well as the Texas General Land Office, prepare a joint report to the legislature on various issues. One of the issues that the legislature asked us to take a look at was whether the jurisdiction over CO2 sequestration should be consolidated into one agency. That group made two recommendations. They provided two options. One was to consolidate the jurisdiction at the Railroad Commission. The other was, if they didn't consolidate it, to make some changes to the statutes. Hopefully 1284 will be signed and it will be a lot less complicated in the future. Next slide, please. Basically, the legislation also requires that the Texas School Land Board establish a state CO2 repository in state submerged land. So these are coastal lands. These are waters along the coast of Texas in state waters. It also required the Bureau of Economic Geology to identify locations and formations for potential repositories. And in April 7th of 2021, the School Land Board used the information that the Bureau of Economic Geology developed to submit a request for proposals for submerged tracts in Jefferson County. And from what I understand, the time has closed, and I haven't had a chance to have an email in to see what and how many applications the School Land Board and the General Land Office received. So that's kind of something a little bit different. One of the things that I want to mention there is I believe that these repositories are wonderful potentials for a couple of reasons. Number one, they're very close to the coast, and along the coast is the area where in Texas we generate the most CO2. So you have a lot of sources in one area that can be transmitted or transported to a state repository under submerged lands. The other is you only have one landowner. Basically, it's the state of Texas. And so you don't have to worry about various surface owners and mineral interest or interest in pore space. That's basically a settled issue. It is the state of Texas. The other issue is that we have really good geology along there. And so there's some really good potential storage areas with very little threat to USDWs in state submerged lands. Next slide, please. In December of 2010, the Railroad Commission finalized as well. Our rules became effective. Clearly, we adopted our regulations a little bit ahead of EPA. There are a few areas where we have identified in working through our crosswalk where we may have to do some amendments. And I think that may be true of many states, particularly if the states don't just adopt the EPA regulations wholesale by reference. The statutes required the state to apply for federal Class 6 primacy, but it did not give us any deadline. Next slide, please. Our focus generally since 2009 to about a year ago has mostly been on the storage of CO2 associated with enhanced oil recovery. We've been in the enhanced recovery business for decades, over 50 years. We have a lot of experience, and we do have several projects that are using the anthropogenic CO2 and enhanced oil recovery. Over the past year, obviously, I think everybody knows there's been a greatly increased interest in storage that's not associated with EOR, particularly with industry ESG efforts with respect to CO2, changes in the incentives that provided for geologic storage, such as 45Q, and then obviously the new administration. The Railroad Commission staff have a goal of providing to our commissioners a draft application for primacy by the end of summer. So basically, it would be everything without the signatures for them to take a look at. We would then go to the Attorney General to get that letter, to the Governor to get that letter. EPA has graciously been talking to us, and we hope to gain from the experience of Wyoming and North Dakota and Louisiana, as well as EPA on this effort. Next slide, please. That's basically it. It's a very short presentation. I just did our statutory framework, our rulemaking, and then our efforts on primacy. We do appreciate EPA's assistance and also the assistance of staff in Wyoming and North Dakota and Louisiana. I will mention that EPA has gotten together staff at Louisiana and at the Railroad Commission to discuss potential interboundary issues. And so I imagine that will be a discussion that will be ongoing for the near future. That's it. Be happy to answer questions when all the presentations are finished.
Leslie, thank you so much for that update. I'm glad to hear that 1284 is heading to the governor's desk for signature. Congratulations on that. And so now I will turn it over to the great state of Louisiana. And Blake, I see you have company in the room with you. I like it. There's strength in numbers. So with that, I will turn it over to you to share an update from Louisiana's perspective.
Thank you, Patrice, and thank you for allowing us to participate. I do have Steve Lee, who's the head of the Underground Injection Control Regulatory Program for Louisiana. In Louisiana, they're all under one office and in one division. So, you know, just generally, Louisiana's seen a whole lot of movement towards carbon capture and sequestration deployment in the state over the past couple of years. We've heard from approximately 40 or more various companies showing interest in carbon sequestration, and by that I mean carbon sequestration, storage in saline aquifers as opposed to enhanced oil recovery. That's a major increase from where we were if you go back to 2010 when EPA's Class 6 regulations became final. At that time, there was definitely more interest on the EOR side, and like I think a few people have said, you know, we think the increase in the 45Q tax credits played a large role in that. Unsurprisingly, when we talked with interested parties, one of the main things that they support is for the state to gain primacy and, you know, to be able to bring some of those additional resources that the state can put towards the program, towards the program of, reviewing permits and making these permit decisions. In Louisiana, there was a 2009 law, which sounds very similar to what was mentioned regarding the Texas law. And in that law, it placed most, if not all, of the aspects of CCS policy, regulation, and granting of pore space rights within various offices of the Department of Natural Resources. There have been several amendments to that law over the years, especially in the last couple of years. And right now at our legislature, which is also in session, House Bill 572 by Representative Melinda White is working its way through the process and hopefully getting close to finalization. And that bill is really focused on ensuring that Steve Lee's program has sufficient funding and contracting authority to implement a Class 6 program so that if and when it gets primacy, it's ready to go. In addition to some of the specifics, I think I'll let Steve Lee get into. I did want to mention we are doing our best to try to reach out to all interested parties, whether that be industry, members of the public, non-governmental agencies and groups. We formed an ad hoc committee at DNR, which also includes a member of the LSU law faculty to help us identify areas surrounding CCS that maybe we need to improve or we need to address. And often these areas focus not directly on the Class 6 regulatory process, but many of the issues surrounding CCS that may be outside Class 6, such as how do you manage and conserve oil and gas natural resources? How do you deal with competing uses? How do you address issues of liability and long-term management? So we found a lot of good input so far with that ad hoc group, and we will continue to meet. We've had to take a bit of a hiatus as the legislative session's ongoing, just because we're spread a bit thin staff-wise in trying to do all of that. And so I'm going to kick it over to Steve Lee. I know we're kind of running short on time if we're going to have time for questions. So would like Steve to just give sort of a basic rundown of what's been done so far on the primary enforcement authority track and where they stand right now.
Okay, thank you, Blake. First, congratulations, Wyoming and North Dakota on the primacy. We're hoping to be the number 3. And right now we think we're probably on track for possibly the 4th quarter of this year. We feel really good about the 1st quarter of 2022, actually receiving primacy from the EPA. It's a process we've been going through, I think, and I have to give credit to my staff and also the EPA. They have really done a great job of shepherding us through this process and streamlining it. I mean, I think it looks like we're on track to actually end up with it in 3 years from the time I started working on the regulations. But that's kind of where we are on it. I will tell you that we are going to use the EPA's GSDT tool. When you go through this process, you look at the regulations and you understand that the EPA is going to be receiving most of the documents from your operators that you receive that's submitted to the state. So we think it just makes sense to go in and use their data tool. I think it's going to facilitate very smooth handoffs of permits, applications that are already pending. I always encourage potential applicants to go ahead and apply with the EPA. So that's kind of where we are on our primacy. We already have our rules in place. We're finalizing our package. We're going to, I think we have a public hearing scheduled for July the 6th. After that, of course, we'll take comments and then we will submit our final package to the EPA, hopefully for approval. So we're seeing just unprecedented interest in this stuff. We have some people come in, they really don't know anything about injection wells, but they know that for the future of their company, that they're going to have to do CO2 sequestration. Some of them are very well versed. They've already had operations in the UIC world for many years, so they know exactly how to proceed with this. As Blake said, we're probably dealing with over 40 companies right now. I know that I think Bill or Molly had mentioned that the EPA has talked to approximately 40 companies. Well, we're talking to some people that have not approached you yet, because we're seeing a huge groundswell of interest, and it's just building. It's not letting off. We're talking to new people, it seems like every week. But it's very exciting. We look forward to it. The other states out there who are interested in getting primacy, we'll be glad to talk to you. We'll be glad to give you what suggestions we can, what to do, what not to do, because we feel like we're getting to the end of this process, and so we've kind of been through it. But with that being said, Blake, I know we're running out of time.
Yeah, I'll just kick it back to you, Patrice, to allow some time for questions. Thank you.
Sure, much appreciated. And if our speakers want to get ready for some questions, I'm actually going to start off with two questions for Bill and for Molly. The first one comes from the chat, and by the way, for those in the audience, if you want to please place questions that are top of mind in the chat feature, I'll scroll through them and help moderate this discussion. But for Bill and Molly, the question is, it appeared from your map that there could be approximately 40 Class 6 permits moving forward in various states. How will $3 million help accelerate the permitting process that is now more than 2 years in length?
Well, thank you for the question. So I think partly, it's kind of like, well, we have been kind of working with a lot of different entities and having conversations, helping them understand like what the expectations are for the permitting, needs. I think, at least from where we're at right now, we're not expecting all of those entities to be coming in this year. I think right now we're estimating probably about 12 applications by the end of the calendar year. With that, we have also been working on, streamlining our process. So we've been working on tools to kind of help the permit writers in their evaluation, as well as developing tools for applicants to ensure that we have more complete applications so that we're better able to process those applications when they come in.
Thanks, Bill, for that. And I'm going to throw this question to you as well. And it was directed to all panelists, but it might be best to start with you all at headquarters. But can you please comment on the scientific basis for treating a CO2 EOR well as a Class 2 well, while a CO2 sequestration well is treated as a Class 6 well?
Well, so I think, a fair bit of that, from our perspective is that, with enhanced recovery, you are looking at, a system where you're balancing the pressures within that reservoir, right? So you have production wells that you're pulling up fluids from, as well as you're injecting. When you're looking at, long-term geologic sequestration, you don't have that production element, so that, you're going to end up having these, very large area reviews because the pressure is not mitigating within that system, so that plume is expanding out, far away from the well.
Okay, and then just another question, Bill, for you, and then I'll talk. Oh, does someone else want to weigh in on that? I'm sorry. No? Okay. You think about Class 2 and Class 6 and the potential transition of Class 2 wells to Class 6 wells, and what are there, 18,000-ish Class 2 wells that are permitted in the U.S. right now? What percentage of those do you think about the number that might transition from Class 2 to Class 6?
I haven't thought about the number that might transition. I will say that, we have thought about what transitioning from Class 2 to Class 6 might look like. And, we did put together a memo, from a previous Office of Groundwater Drinking Water Director that kind of spoke to the transition between Class 2 and Class 6.
Great, thanks. So Lily, there was a question in the chat directed to you, wanting to know how many Class 6 applications are currently in process in the state of Wyoming.
Okay, so we've had, I've spoken to quite a few operators about the potential of getting Class 6 permits. As of now, we do not have any. We've been working with the University of Wyoming as part of their project for carbon sequestration. And so there will be some confusion as people go forward because we're actually going to be going down a Class 1 route for those wells, just because University of Wyoming, they will never be using those wells under them for carbon sequestration. At least that's my understanding. Any testing that they're going to be doing will be using brine and not the carbon dioxide. So it's somewhat of a Class 6 world for that permit, but it's going to be a Class 1 permit just because of the semantics and the background of the well. So in short, we don't have any at this time, but there is anticipation of some coming in the near future.
Okay, thank you for that, Lily. I don't see additional, oh, here comes a question. How is EPA dealing with pore space ownership and trespassing in their review process is a new question that just came in.
So, pore space is, really outside of, our regulatory construct. So, we do recognize that there are other, say, rules that states might have or local governments. So we do try to make sure that we're coordinating with, other, governmental entities as we're kind of reviewing this, because we do want to make sure that we're, putting forward something that makes sense. But, as far as like our particular regulatory framework, it doesn't speak to pore space issues.
Yeah, so I might just hop in on that. I mean, I really appreciate that answer, Bill, because there are components of the CO2 storage project that fall outside the purview of the UIC program. And so, at one point I had an opportunity to work with a task force with the IOGCC, and we documented that very piece right there, that there are these elements of a project. If you develop a project from cradle to grave that fall outside of the scope of the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act's UIC program, pore space amalgamation is one of them. I think Lily kind of hit on a few that, if you want to develop, characterize your formation, you may have to drill a stratigraphic test well or shoot 3D or a seismic survey. Those would fall under like an oil and gas type agency that would permit those activities. So the takeaway from that report, at least in my mind, was, states have to be involved somewhat. There is some involvement from the states, even if they don't want Class 6 primacy.
Thanks, Kevin, for weighing in. I'm going to just put the panelists here on the spot, just to give you a heads up. We're going to do just a lightning round here. And Bill and Molly, I'm going to start with you because, Molly, you were asked this question previously, I think when you met with the MOU States Coordination Group. But, what are some things that we all collectively can be doing, both with potential well applicants, in our outreach or education efforts? What are the most important things we can be doing to help, everyone succeed here with Class 6 and knowing just kind of the exponential growth that we're seeing overall? What's most important, or what's top of mind for you for the stakeholders on this webinar?
Molly, do you want to start?
Sure. So when I think of what we can communicate to those who are interested in coming in and applying for a Class 6 permit, really the important things that we want to emphasize are early communication with the permitting authority to make sure that any red flags are identified, any technical questions can be answered as early as possible, early interaction with the GSDT, if that's the tool that they're using, as well as referring applicants to our guidance documents and the tools that we have developed. Because what we found is that what we anticipate really shortening and streamlining the process for us as permit reviewers is having a complete and technically sound application. The first time we are looking at it, first time we're receiving a complete application, so that it cuts down on some of the back and forth and need to go back and get additional data.
So the only thing that I would add to what Molly indicated was that, is also recognizing that there are other resources out there too. I believe, DOE has put together a lot of different supporting documents to help with considerations around site characterization and other elements of, the class, or I should say, geologic sequestration in general. So kind of utilizing those resources, I think, helps position applicants in a good way as they're putting together the Class 6 application.
Okay, thanks, Bill. And now our illustrious state panelists, I'm going to throw a similar question to you. What are the most important things we need right now? Obviously there are, some states that are in the process of seeking primacy. Is it, agency staffing? Is it, is there a long list of geologists and geoscientists and other types of people that are going to be needed to review, permits? What are the things that are critical here that we can all help work to achieve so that this is successful in the long run?
Okay, Patrice, I'll try to field that question from a Louisiana standpoint. These types of wells and review has a lot of similarities and a lot in common with other UIC applications that we review, but there are also some new elements, and we're going to need new skill sets for that. And there's two ways that I know of you can do it. You can't hardly hire somebody that has that skill set. You either have to develop it or you have to outsource for it. And in Louisiana, the legislation that we are trying to move through right now will allow us to, at least in the early stages, in the interim, we can outsource for computer modelers and maybe specialized engineers and geochemists that we don't have on staff. And it's a skill. It will be a very rare skill set to find. There won't be many people out there that have these particular skill sets. So that's what I would say that we're going to need. We are going to need more people. I guess most of the programs that I know of, and ours included, with the wells that we already have in the programs, we're already maxed out as far as our time goes. So we will have to have new warm bodies in here in order to process these applications. And that usually translates into money at the end of the day.
Thanks for that. Kevin, Lily, Leslie, anyone else want to comment on that?
This is Leslie. I might mention that the Groundwater Protection Council actually did a study on what the states would need for the Class 6 implementation for gaining primacy, as well as for implementation of the program once they achieve primacy. And there's quite a bit of information in there. A lot of the states had a lot of input into that document. And so that might be at least a good answer there. But I know that they, as well as the National Petroleum Council, in their dual challenges report, mentioned that Congress needs to give both EPA and the states additional money, not only for the Class 6 program, but for the other classes, because it's been greatly underfunded for the last several decades. So again, I agree. It's probably money to help us either contract for the services that we require to make this program work the way we hope it does, or for in-house staff.
Yeah, I'm glad Leslie said it, because I don't work for the state anymore, so I can't say it's underfunded, but it has historically been underfunded. So thank you for saying that. That's the UIC programs in general. What North Dakota did in 2011, when Class 6 was created and they decided they wanted to obtain Class 6 primacy, the legislature appropriated $532,000 into a fund that was created earlier in 2009. I mentioned the trust fund for the long-term management of a closed site. They also created a storage facility administrative fund, and there's a fee that is associated with that fund for every ton of CO2 goes into that. So eventually, as these projects come online and start injecting, the state will be collecting a fee per ton of CO2 that is meant to, that fund is meant to cover the administrative costs of regulating the program. Another piece that's been mentioned, I think, by both Wyoming and Louisiana. North Dakota has taken a different route. It is going to be all evaluated all in-house. The expertise is either going to is really going to be developed in-house, and that's how it was when I was there, and that's how it is today. Specifically, the biggest one to tackle is the computational modeling and simulation. Myself, I went down to Houston for training with a computer modeling group. The state uses that software for simulation efforts, and then the person that's in that role now is well versed in geologic modeling and computational simulation to the point where he can verify an application and run the inputs that he receives to verify it's in compliance.
Okay, we're almost at time, but we are going to sneak one last question in. This is for Lily, Kevin, Leslie, and Blake. Does your state have authority to claim eminent domain for those surface owners unwilling to contribute their minority interest within the proposed storage area? What other remedies are available if eminent domain is not available? And someone else commented that Nebraska just passed legislation approving forced pooling of pore space for CCS. But I'll just throw that question out there if there's anyone that wants to take a shot with an answer.
I'll start. North Dakota in 2009 when they established pore space ownership, they also established the amalgamation, another word for unitization, amalgamation of that project area where the pore space needs to be, the consent needs to be obtained or leased. And that threshold 60%. So once the applicant meets that threshold and gets over 60% of the pore space leased, then the non-consenting pore space owners through that statute can be forced amalgamated into the project.
Yeah, and Patrice,
Thanks,
from Louisiana's perspective, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so in Louisiana, the 2009 Act that I mentioned did authorize expropriation authority. There is a expedited process. It is requires litigation to expropriate in the state. And you do have to make a good faith effort and follow certain procedures, to try to reach a agreement with a private landowner before taking that route, but it does authorize that. Additionally, it does require that the commissioner basically approve the storage area itself, and requires, I think it's 3/4 of the mineral owners if you're going to inject into a reservoir that has oil and gas capable of being produced in paying quantities. So there's, I guess, a couple steps there, but the expropriation is in statute.
Thanks, Blake. So, I just really appreciate all of our fantastic speakers for taking the time today to share your knowledge and have this discussion. It's been fascinating. I've learned a lot, and we will provide a recording of the webinar and the slide deck to everyone who registered for the webinar, and look forward to continuing to work with all of you on Class 6 going forward. Thanks again.